Hello, everyone, and happy International Women's Day. I'm Sarah Ingwerson. I'm a partner at the SR Group, the parent company of Brewer Morris, Carter Murray, Fraser Jones, Keller West, and Taylor Root. And I am delighted to welcome you all here today. Thank you for joining. We have over 500 registrations for today, which is absolutely incredible. And I know that some people are joining as we talk, so I can see those numbers going up, which is great. The theme of our webinar this year is Find Your Voice. And despite decades of effort, we are still in a world where gender equality remains an ongoing journey. It's crucial to address the challenges and celebrate the triumphs of women as we navigate through male-dominated industries and companies. Today, we're exploring the intricacies of this journey, uncovering the barriers hindering women from expressing our voices, and also discovering the pivotal role that organisations can play in fostering empowerment. So from practical strategies to personal anecdotes, we're aiming today to equip women with the tools that we need to confidently assert ourselves and thrive. So thank you for joining as we embark on a journey of empowerment and inspiration, hopefully igniting the spark within each of us to find our voice, help others find their voice, and make a difference. Welcome to Find Your Voice. So the format for today's webinar will be a question and answer session with our three panellists, who I'm just about to introduce. And then we'll have time for questions at the end. So please use the chat function, and please help me out by just directing who you'd like the question to be answered by. It is my great pleasure to introduce our three panellists for today. First, we have Bowdeen Moorman, who is the Head of Commercial Pricing and Strategy for Causeway Technologies. Bowdeen is a commercial executive and technology lawyer with over a decade of experience in senior leadership roles. She's currently in a commercial pricing role at Causeway Technologies, who are a market-leading construction tech company. Bowdeen is also a single parent to 3 young children, whilst working a demanding full-time schedule. And balancing this, as I know from knowing Bowdeen for some time, has involved a fair share of speaking up and finding her own voice, as Bowdeen encourages others to find that balance too. Welcome, Bowdeen. Next, we have Sabine Schauter, who is a partner in finance and restructuring at Greenberg Traurig. Sabine, on behalf of Greenberg's, is one of the first working group members of the Code V initiative that launched in December 2023. So Code V is an alliance between the Dutch government, the financial industry, and advocacy sectors. And this collaboration is committed to promoting equal opportunities for female entrepreneurs in the Netherlands. Sabine remains as a member of the council that's been appointed to continue the implementation and promotion of Code V. Welcome, Sabine. And finally, we have Becky Hewitt, OBE. Becky is the multiple award-winning CEO of Ken & Co. And Becky has spent her career campaigning for equality and social change, leading organisational transformation and building high-performing, values-led cultures in the commercial and voluntary sectors. Becky is the chair of several task forces on the future of flexible working. She is an advisor to the Armstrong Wolf Women in the COO community and has received the Albright Bright List Award for philanthropy. I knew I'd struggle with that word, and was recognised as a Charity Times pandemic pioneer and a Charity Comms inspiring communicator. And to top it all off, Becky has an OBE for her services to people with visible differences. So I'm sure you will all agree in the audience that we're in excellent company today to guide us through this conversation. So welcome all three of you, and thank you very much for joining. So before we kick off the Q&A part of our webinar, we're going to start with a poll just to get a temperature check of the audience. So I will ask my wonderful marketing assistant in the background to launch that. Hopefully you can then see it. Great. So the question I'd like you to all answer is, why are you joining this webinar today? Do you want to find your voice, or do you want to help others find their voice? You have about a minute to answer. Okay, we're probably ready to launch the results now, Eglay. Okay, great. So 66% of you are here to get inspiration on what you can do to speak up and find your voice. But encouragingly, 34% of you are here to support others, which I think is really useful for our panelists to know in terms of how we address the answers to our questions. So Bowdeen, I'm going to start with you. You've seen firsthand the impact of women not having their voices heard in the workplace. Why do you feel that it's been difficult for women to speak up and find their voice?
Well, firstly, thank you, Sarah. Thank you for having me and inviting me to participate in this discussion, which I'm super excited about. It's a really important topic. There are a lot of elements. Sorry, I'm already losing my voice. There are a lot of elements to this question, right? Social, biological factors. These are kind of being the obvious big players. And I thought I'd start with a little anecdote. So my younger brother once proudly told me that he'd seen a documentary that evidenced that boys were programmed to zone out of hearing higher pitched voices. And he felt that this was full justification for ignoring me. And I mean, the fact this little anecdote aside, this is very powerful, right? For research to suggest that men are programmed not to listen to high pitched voices and women are born with a higher pitch in their voice, that is an immediate biological hurdle. And then you add to that equation, you add menstruation, pregnancy, maternity, menopause. Yeah.
The full cycle.
Yeah, the full cycle. And, we are all conscious of these hurdles, and it seems to be openly discussed now. Yet, harassment and discrimination of women remains rife. I mean, I'm sure many people have seen that just in the press recently on Monday, The Guardian published an article titled Sexism in the City, which highlights a number of stories from women in the financial sector who were interviewed as part of a government review into harassment in the workplace. I myself have been on the receiving end and have also been witness to behavior bordering on and clearly qualifying as harassment and discrimination, specifically directed at women, and much relates to these biological hurdles that I had mentioned. Very disappointingly, this often ends up being addressed through dismissal and settlement process with strong NDAs that then silence the issue, which this morning, another article from The Guardian, following on from the one on Monday, is stating that MPs are calling for a crackdown on NDAs after the extent of the sexual harassment and bullying against women in the financial sector had come to light via that government inquiry, which is fantastic. We all know this is happening. It's being written about. But I feel that this structure, the use of NDAs and inadequacies around whistleblowing practices is really the foundation for a global silencing of issues that predominantly, but not exclusively, affect women. This structure permits this behavior and it silences us all. It generates fear, and it's a huge factor in women's hesitation to speak up. And I can go into a little bit more detail on this later, but rightly, this is an area where there's a lot of focus and a drive to change. And I am honestly pretty excited about this morning's article, about this talk, and about the number of other activities that are taking place in this area.
It does seem that there's a movement that's slowly starting to happen. And I think as we've all talked about, just before we joined and in the lead up to this conversation is not just a female issue. This is a people issue. This involves men and women being part of the discussion, part of the conversation. And I think your point about your brother, I mean, I wonder how many other brothers in the world have done that to their little sisters, but it resonates with me about the term bossy that's often used to describe little girls. I was called bossy. My daughter's been called bossy. And I think that language has such a negative connotation. And if little girls grow up being called bossy and being apologetic for that, the impacts confidence, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it's still prevalent when you are in the workplace and you're older, because I have personally experienced being called controlling when my male counterpart is called in control, which is fundamentally a different connotation for the exactly same word, effectively, right? I mean, yeah.
Thank you for that. Becky, just in terms of looking outside the individual and at the companies, Kin & Co is a disruptive consultancy, and you specialise in purpose and culture-led change management to create harmonious and supportive environments so that women and men have equal opportunity to talk out and to find their voice. How do you go about this, and why is this important for organisations to embrace this?
Yeah. So I'll start with Kin & Co's purpose, because we always start there. And one of the things I want to talk a lot about today is the real role of culture in either supporting women to find their voice or preventing them to find their voice. So our purpose is to make every organization work for the world. And that means we use purpose, culture change, and behavioral science to help organizations deliver on their strategy, improve on their performance, but most importantly, to build sustainable, safe, and equitable organizations for everybody. And in practice, this means that we help organizations to really understand what the strengths of their culture are, but also the really important things that maybe need to change. And one of the most frequent and pressing challenges businesses are coming to us about at the moment is the fact that their people, and particularly marginalized groups and women, don't feel safe speaking up in their organizations. And a couple of things, just more things to say about Kin & Co that feel really important as it's International Women's Day. We're a B Corp. We're really proud to be female-led. We're LGBTQ+ owned. And one of our own values is see and be seen. And that's all about creating safe spaces where people really can be seen and heard. And it's this point about safe spaces that is feeling really resonant for me today, particularly in light of the report, the Treasury report into Sexism in the City that Badine mentioned just now. That is an absolutely stark reminder that harassment, sexual misconduct, discrimination, lack of opportunity, and other inequality is endemic in business today. And actually, one of the things that shocked me about that is really there's been so little noise about it. You know, a couple of Guardian articles, which is wonderful, but there's not been an outcry. And I keep asking myself why that is. And, you know, is it because actually we know this and we've come to accept the unacceptable? And just imagine if that situation was reversed. If there had been a report saying that level of men were facing lack of safety and inequality, it would be a revolution. And this is a ripple. And there are two problems, I think, in my view. So the first is about women's voices being silenced and they're not able to speak up. But even more than that, their voices are just not being listened to and they're not being heard. They're ignored, they're gaslighted, they're made to feel like they're making a fuss about nothing, their voices are too high, they're silenced by these NDAs. And like you, Badine, I am so blooming pleased to see that recommendation in the report today. It's really good news that happens. So I guess my kind of concluding point is, in my experience, actually organizations are full of women's voices. But what we're missing is cultures that amplify those voices. And even more importantly, ears, and particularly the ears of men, that are prepared to listen to them.
And it's creating that psychological safety in an organisation, isn't it, where women feel comfortable to speak up, that their voices will be heard.
Absolutely that.
And we'll talk further about some case studies and examples and what organisations can do. I mean, there's so much. Each of you could talk separately for the whole webinar. There's so much to cover. So we'll move on to you, Sabine, because obviously shifting from organisational change to government initiatives, you've obviously been really actively involved in the implementation of Code V in the Netherlands. And this follows the success of the code in the UK. Can you just give a brief overview on what the code actually is and the benefit to female entrepreneurs and why it was important to put this in place in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, ironically, I've lost my voice today, which, you know, hopefully will sort of be hearable. But anyways, no, thanks. Your summary in the beginning was really accurate. So Code V is a Dutch alliance between the financial industry, government and advocacy sector aimed at accelerating female entrepreneurship, amongst others by providing mentorship, networking opportunities, and financial support to women entrepreneurs through workshops, events, collaborations with businesses. Code V seeks to create an environment that encourages women to start and grow their ventures. So the long-term goal is to create a more diverse and inclusive business ecosystem that fosters innovation and boosts the female employment rate, because the whole economy can benefit from that. So the efforts of the Alliance will also contribute, as I said, to economic growth by supporting female entrepreneurs in scaling up their businesses and expanding them internationally. So that's why we're also so pleased with the UK Investing in Women Code, because in the end, it calls for systemic change and sustained collaborations between the public and private sectors. And Code, we have been inspired, as I said, by the UK Investing in Women Code, and that was founded in 2019, and that has already led to a larger financing flow to women entrepreneurs.
And from what you've seen in your profession as a lawyer and through your work with Code V, what way do cultural or societal norms impact a woman's ability to find her voice?
Well, I can rant about that forever, but I think a few things.
In 2 minutes.
Right, go. Well, gender stereotypes is, I think, a very important one. I think cultural and societal norms often dictate traditional gender roles, which can lead to stereotypes about women's capabilities and roles, including in law and entrepreneurship. Work-life balance expectations. We're often expected to balance professional careers with caregiving and household responsibilities, which can create additional challenges in finding time and energy to fully engage and express our voices in professional settings. Another one is implicit bias and discrimination. Cultural and societal norms may perpetuate implicit biases and systemic discrimination against women in the workplace, including, again, legal profession. And this can manifest in hiring practices, promotion opportunities, access to resources, and so on. Another one I think is important to mention is lack of representation. I experienced that personally very much. I mean, in male-dominated fields like law and entrepreneurship, the lack of representation, role models, women in leadership positions and decision-making roles can create sense of isolation, making it difficult for them to find role models and mentors to support their voices. And overcoming these barriers with, I think, an initiative like Code V and also the legal profession can take, we can take several proactive steps. It's promoting diversity and inclusion, leadership and development and mentorship programs, addressing that gender bias, discrimination, and creating safe spaces for dialogue. I mean, that's so important, especially for this theme. And by this initiative, we can actually help create that environment where women are empowered to find their voice and express them, and authentically, contributing to greater equality and diversity.
And it's such an incredible initiative and so powerful, and hopefully it will be rolled out to other countries and other jurisdictions with the great work.
Working on that. So
You've
people can reach out, through the chatter afterwards, if they want to hear more.
And you have 66 signatories, don't you, at the moment?
Yeah, we do now, and we're growing and continuing creating cohorts to have more people join. Yeah.
Well done. On top of your full-time job as a partner in a law firm.
And mother of 3 young kids.
This is the thing, just to touch on that, because you said it earlier, there is like a constant guilt that you feel, right? As a working mother. It's when you're working, you're guilty that you feel guilty you're not spending time with your children. And when you're with your children, you feel guilty that you're not,
No, it's so intense. Yeah, it's hard to deal with.
It's really
all experience that probably as working moms. So it's intense.
I think when you become a parent, either a mother or a father, you have guilt. I think your life changes so much, and I think the acceptance of that just makes it easy to deal with. You have to accept that shift, don't you?
Yeah.
But Sabine, you covered so many interesting points there, and on the one hand, it feels like we've come so far to the point that we've got mainstream press like The Guardian doing investigations into sexism in the city, an initiative in the Netherlands following one in the UK that's been signed by 66 signatories, including 4 of the major Dutch banks. But then hearing what you're saying as well about the systemic bias, the gender stereotypes, we've still got so far to go. That's
so far.
Exhausting, doesn't it? But we will get there. We will get there. Right. Let me see. Where am I up to? Becky, from what Sabine said, does this resonate with the work that you've done at Kin & Co, particularly in the concept of Speak Up? And can you perhaps explain what Speak Up is and the behaviours behind it?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, absolutely, it does resonate. And actually, one of the things that really struck me while you were speaking is a reflection that so much of the work to make change and progress is done by women who have full-time jobs, full-time caring responsibilities, and this effort and passion is coming on top of everything else. It's voluntary and discretionary, doesn't get recognized. So I think just all power to everybody who's investing their time on top of everything else to do that.
It will be worth it.
It will be worth it. Well, and it's urgent. But absolutely about Speak Up. So let me say a little bit about how we define that. So we think about speaking up is really a group of behaviors and a set of cultural conditions that enable and support those behaviors to take place. So there are lots of behaviors, but a couple of examples might be challenging the way things are done. It might be raising concerns about behaviors, microaggressions, experiences that are unsafe or discriminatory. And then it also might be sharing different perspectives, ideas, fresh thinking, new ways of doing things. So those are the kinds of behaviors that Speak Up can involve. And in terms of the cultural conditions, we're talking about psychological safety, as you said earlier, Sarah, coupled with colleagues and leaders and men really genuinely listening to and appropriately acting on the voices of people who do speak up. And as I keep saying, listening is just as important as speaking up.
Yeah.
And you can have all the policies and the procedures in the world, and they simply will not work. And they particularly will not work for women or other people who don't have structural or systemic power if the cultures and behaviors are not in place. And I've lost count of the number of times that powerful men have said, I don't understand why this isn't happening. We have our general counsel, we have policies. Why don't they just work? And that's because there are cultural signals being sent to people who don't have power that it's not safe for them to use them.
So why should Speak Up matter then to an organisation?
So lots of different reasons, but there are three. We think about it as three main reasons. So the first is around what we call inclusion, health, and engagement. So it builds a sense of belonging, safety, trust, loyalty, well-being, preventative about burnout, loyalty, pride, all those really good things in cultures. It's absolutely critical for innovation. So organizations who want to hear new ideas, creativity, diverse perspectives, challenge, they have to have environments where people feel safe and rewarded sharing that fresh thinking. When a woman speaks, we hear anecdotes all the time that women share an idea and no one listens, and then a man shares it and everyone's like, oh, that's brilliant. And if you look in the financial sector, that they often talk about how groupthink contributed to the financial crash. There wasn't that sense that people felt safe to speak up and that a diverse number of people were challenging. So it's critical to that. And then the final one is about managing risk. Speaking up is critical to managing risk. And that's everything from, if you want to be an organization that's on the front foot, that's taking good risks in order to move forward, you have to have speaking up. But also it's about risk mitigation and prevention, and stopping misconduct happening. And actually, companies with a strong speak up culture are 50% less likely to experience misconduct. So it's important for all of those reasons. It's absolutely business critical. And I said at the start, it's also one of the things that companies are increasingly saying they don't feel confident that they're getting right, and particularly for women.
And Bowden touched on this earlier, but from what you've seen with the clients that you've worked with, why do females in particular find it difficult to speak up, do you think?
Well, I mean, lots of reasons, but I think that there are two, that are particular. So speaking up and the ability to speak up is influenced on lots of levels, but one of those is around societal, cultural, and patriarchal stereotypes. So as Sabine was saying, all those stereotypes about women's voices. So for example, men who speak up are authoritative, in control, assertive. Women are shrill, disruptive, hysterical, aggressive, bossy. And we have internalized all those beliefs. We've got learned behaviors about not rocking the boat, pleasing other people. And that can genuinely lead to a lack of confidence. It can lead to lack of skills or agency about how to voice your opinions. And actually sometimes quite a deeply held belief that maybe my opinion is not important. So that's one level. But the second is that speaking up is genuinely a really vulnerable behavior because it involves real personal risk. And I want to be really clear, this isn't just about women's confidence or, imposter syndrome. It's because the risks are real, we're just noticing them. It's not because we're not confident enough, we're just reacting to reality. There is a real risk of social rejection, repercussions that damage your reputation, your personal standing, cost you your jobs and your career progression. And I guess I'd ask a question to everybody on the webinar, but this is particularly for the men who are here, is think back to a time when you let a discriminatory comment or a microaggression pass in the room. Why didn't you say anything? Maybe you were thinking, I don't want to risk this relationship. I don't want to be seen as difficult or make things awkward. I don't want to damage my standing. It's not worth the risk. But the problem that creates is it creates what we call in sort of behavioral psychology terms, a social norm in that organization. That norm is we don't speak out, we don't raise our voice. And if the powerful people in the organization are saying that, my God, it makes it even more difficult for women to speak out. And of course, it's more difficult, but the burden falls to them. The risk falls to the people who have less structural power to take those risks. And often that risk just feels too high, and it is too high.
And especially if you're a lone voice around that table, if you're a senior female and one of only a few, coming up against the institution is very tough.
I can think of multiple times where I've heard something that's not okay. And I've looked around at the men, the peers of this person who was older than me, more senior people, and thought, why aren't you saying anything?
Mm.
And then having to like dig deep and find, that heat you feel when you're
Yes.
like,
Yeah.
and just that sense of disappointment that why was it left to me to do that?
I love the work that Kin & Co is doing, and I wish there were more companies like you, pushing out into the mainstream corporate world, because I think there's so much change that needs to happen at a corporate level. Bowdeen, you've been working with a very prominent barrister and now mediator, Marina Wheeler KC, and you've been lobbying for changes to non-disclosure agreements, NDAs, and whistleblowing. How do you think these changes could support women who've been the victims of whistleblowing, of workplace harassment or bullying?
So that huge question and huge topic, which, is great. So yes, I have been supporting Marina Wheeler, who's working together with Emily Thornberry, our shadow Attorney General, to formulate ways to tackle sexual harassment in the workplace. And one of their main concerns too is women not speaking up. And they've been looking at weaknesses in the whistleblowing regime as the key focus area for them, which is super exciting, right? And this is where I kind of touched on earlier, that there's so much going on. There's a lot of positives too, and I don't want to lose sight of that. We are doing so much work, but I'll just talk a little bit more about the detail of that. So when we look at whistleblowing, and this goes to some of the things you've just said, Becky, as well, is whistleblowing is engineered to enable women and men to speak up, right? Men can also speak up through a whistleblowing process on behalf of somebody else, and for themselves, of course, but it's not necessarily terribly effective. How safe is it to make a whistleblowing disclosure? And it's a very intricate area of law, because the whole point of whistleblowing is when you make a whistleblowing disclosure, protected disclosure, you're protected by law. You have, better protections when you come to an employment tribunal, and there's only certain disclosures that fall into the category of protected disclosure. And they must be made in the public interest. They relate to criminal offenses. They relate to failure to comply with legal obligations or miscarriage of justice, or health and safety or environment. And a disclosure about bullying, harassment, or discrimination doesn't clearly fall into these categories. So that's quite difficult. That's one thing to look at. And then if we add the use of NDAs to this kind of dynamic, right? What's relatively unknown about NDAs is that actually they're not enforceable in the event of a protected disclosure. So if bullying and harassment were to be considered protected disclosures, the NDAs would no longer be enforceable, and organizations might take more time to consider their approach to harassment and discrimination as a greater priority. That's kind of the background gist of how this is all interplaying together and how we can change the landscape through, legal change. The reason NDAs are such an issue, and I appreciate I'm kind of flitting about, but this is such a big topic, is NDAs they don't only silence a story, they also have an enormous mental health impact on the recipient, right? You feel ashamed, you feel like you did something wrong. It's very isolating to be told you cannot talk about something that is a big part of your life, most likely, right? It has had a huge impact on how you feel.
And that's often part of the healing process, isn't it?
Yeah, speaking is part of the healing process, and sharing those stories is enabling, right? But your confidence is also lost when you go through the experience that is usually subject to an NDA. It then spirals downwards. It's difficult to get a new role. Meanwhile, employers, they have all the power. An NDA creates a total imbalance of power. The person who's signing an NDA, the employee, is very incentivized to sign the NDA, so they get a reference, they get a financial settlement. They're probably financially dependent on the role that they are just about to lose.
Yeah.
Whereas that's not the case for an employer, right? They might have budget constraints, but it's not the same thing. So it's quite an important area to really look at. And that's why I'm also so excited by this morning's article, where it's announcing that MPs are actually going to look more in detail at the use, or misuse, I should say, of NDAs. And another thing I want to add is the Legal Services Board, which is an oversight regulator for legal services, have just published a summary report in February. It's on their website, and it talks in detail about the misuse of NDAs and how we need to come together and really look at whether or not their use is appropriate and how this is impacting the women's ability to speak up. It's, yeah, a huge topic.
Do you think companies are just relying on them too easily,
Yeah.
without any kind of awareness of the impact that it has on the employee?
Yeah, they just, you know, they want to deal with the issue and move on. And it's funny because it kind of leads to another point. All these NDAs and all this bullying and harassment, it leads to one thing, which is a toxic workplace. And a toxic workplace culture is a real hindrance to revenue, right? Happy culture feeds productivity in quantity and quality, but a toxic workplace has the opposite effect. And this is like, there's a lot of research that supports this.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's quite an important topic if to look at. It's really important.
And that kind of flows on to our next question, actually, in terms of why is it important to create this safe space for whistleblowers, and, you know, the impact that it has on workplace culture and, you know, culture, revenue, you know, purpose, feeling of psychological safety, as we talked about with the work that Becky does.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, imagine, you know, Crispin Audie's firm can't be doing very well right now after all that in the, you know, it's, yeah.
Becky, just moving back to you and the work that you've been doing at Kin & Co. Can you share a success story, perhaps, where purpose and cultural transformation positively impacted women in the workforce, and perhaps bring out what you learned about intersectionality? So anybody who's facing kind of multiple layers of discrimination and how it impacts them and how it could benefit them.
Absolutely. And before I do that, I was just going to build, I couldn't agree more about the point, Badine, you made about toxic cultures and their obviously their impact on commercial performance. But actually, there's some really interesting research by a chap called Donald Sull, and he looks at the impact between toxic culture and physical health, and particularly the physical health of women. And there was an absolutely terrifying correlation between your experience of a toxic culture and the impact that it has on your health and well-being. So it's, you know, it's a really critical issue. But yeah, so I wanted to share an example about some work that that we did, particularly looking at the challenges for speaking up for women of colour. And there are absolutely a kind of additional layer of challenges because of the biases and stereotypes and additional discrimination that they face. So to give you an example of some of the things that we found from our work. So women of colour are more likely to be seen as challenging or difficult when they question, say, an unfair promotion or compensation practices. They are more likely to feel pressure to comply or to accept microaggressions or discrimination. In this research, we found they had a higher burden to sort of build a case and make an argument in order for their voices to be seen as legitimate. More likely to experience being ignored, interrupted, microaggressions, or their ideas being overlooked, credited to somebody else, dismissed when they say them, but hailed as a genius plot when somebody else does. And overall, they are less likely to experience the psychological safety that is a key component to speaking up. And I've also talked about the additional burden that they face in a toxic culture. So there were really absolutely specific additional challenges for women of colour. And in terms of the interventions that we found can be helpful, and obviously it's like specific and individual, and I don't want to overly generalise, but we know that this feeling of being isolated, it's just me, no one else is worrying about this. You know, you mentioned the Crispin Odie case, and in fact, one of the things that they found is they isolated those women and made them feel, well, that no one else is having this problem. So it makes you question, you know, is this really true? But that's a significant barrier for all women, but particularly to women of colour in terms of speaking out. So if you create specific safe spaces where women can come together and actually realise their experience is a part of a broader, more systemic or structural problem, that can be really important in terms of sort of galvanising and creating additional evidence. And another is around upskilling allies to speak up and listen up and take action on the work. Now, that's not about disempowerment, but it's actually about lifting the burden of the work, because very often what happens is there is a real mental health, you know, and a health load of carrying this work, as well as I said, taking all the risks that are real risks earlier. So something about really thinking about what allyship looks like, not just saying the right things, we're doing the right things as well. I mean, and obviously there's lots more, but those are just a couple of examples that we found from our work.
And this is where, as we covered at the beginning, male allyship is so important.
Yeah.
And that's the benefit of doing a webinar, that it's open to everybody. And, you know, we have had men and women joining. I think probably about 75% are women, but, you know, 25% of the audience population are men, which is really encouraging, because we need men to be part of this discussion and also part of the solution. I'd now like to move to some strategies that we can all share, just in terms of finding your voice, and some practical takeaways for our audience. So, Baldine, back to you. What advice or suggestions do you have for women who face bullying at work and are hesitant to speak up?
I'd firstly say knowledge is power. So, okay, so speaking up is a terribly difficult thing to do, right? You run the risk of dismissal, victimization. It's hard. I mean, Becky, you pointed it out beautifully, that speaking up is just difficult to do, period, right? I would recommend that you start by taking notes of the events you have, so you have clear facts to refer to and explain how each event led you to feel. Understand your position in law from a practical point of view. Talk to others who may have experienced this and get their views, and read, you know, go online and read and read and read. Attend these kind of events and connect with people who want to support you and accept that support, which kind of brings me to my second point, is get and accept support, right? Don't suffer alone and don't suffer in silence. It is sometimes really hard to find, but support can be available in the most unlikely of places. I've personally experienced this. You know, share your concerns in a professional way with colleagues, and you might find they have similar experiences. And for these conversations, just a practical tip, I always found it helpful to bring the problem back to myself. So for example, instead of going to a colleague and saying, so-and-so is being not like bullying me, you go to the colleague and say, I am in conflict with so-and-so and would love your advice on how to improve my interactions with them, or how I might adjust my style. You then go into a conversation about the events that are taking place, and that person will very quickly see for themselves what it is that you're being subjected to. And you might suddenly have an ally, right? Yeah, I mean, I really think it's very important to not suffer alone.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's a lot of wonderful takeaways there that I'll share with the group afterwards. Becky, back to you. What role can organisations play, and culture and workplace, in creating an environment where women do feel empowered? I know that's probably such a generalisation for you to sum up in 2 minutes, because this is obviously the crux of what you do at Kin & Co. But how can organisations go about that without women feeling judgment or reprisal?
Yeah, I'll have a go. And just as you were talking about, I was thinking, what you were saying about connection and not feeling alone, and how key that is, but how that's taken away by the NDA process, that sense of, ability to connect with others. And, that's such a problem with that process. But back to what organizations can do. So I'm going to go back to my key theme, which is around listening up. So to hear women's voices, there absolutely needs to be an equal focus on listening up. And listening up is a set of skills and capabilities that need to be named and learned and practiced in an organization, and particularly amongst leaders and the people with power. And those people need to make it absolutely clear in their words and their actions, how they show up in really important moments that matter, when it really counts, that speak up is encouraged and it's celebrated and it's acted on. And as I said, everybody needs to walk the talk on this. Executive, the board, often it's at board level, actually, where this goes wrong, and the wider organization. And just in terms of those specific behaviors, so what do they look like? There's a long list, but it can look like demonstrating empathy, being really aware of your own microaggressions, really active listening, how you manage conflict safely, fairly, real awareness and management of your own blind spots and biases, and that's psychological safety and trust. And we talk a lot to leaders about being aware of your own micro signals. What are the messages that you send that actually you're not interested in speaking up? You're too busy, your door's closed, you're rushing along, your body language is like this, you look impatient. How can you really demonstrate that openness, that warmth that makes people feel safe? And we also ask leaders and colleagues to ask themselves some really important questions. So, for example, whose voice am I not hearing? Whose voice am I unconsciously biased to pay more attention to? You know, when they speak, where does my attention go over other people in the room? You know, who do I pay less attention to and why? And those are really powerful. You can literally do an audit and then challenge yourself. Go and speak to someone new. And then finally, some questions for organizations about what they can do is how many organizations here know how safe all women feel to speak up in their organizations? What data do you have about that? And how important is it to you? Now, how much attention are the exec paying? How much attention are the board paying? Because I'm going to go back to that Sexism in the City report. If you're not hearing, you know, stories of discrimination against women in your organization, it is not because they are not happening. You just simply aren't listening hard enough, and you don't have the systems that mean that they can come to life. So I'm almost more worried for the organizations who are sitting there saying, we don't have a problem. Because we absolutely do. And I think if anything from today, I hope that people think, I don't want to be complacent. I don't want to sit with this risk and this inequity and these hidden stories in my organization. I want to be the kind of organization that prioritizes this, because that will be right for women and ultimately it will be right for everybody.
And following on from Baudi's point about the practical examples that women who have experienced harassment or bullying can take in terms of, you know, taking notes, talking to others, sharing, connecting, reading, what strategies have you found effective in empowering women to actually speak up, to maybe avoid those situations happening in the first place?
This isn't totally an answer to that question, but it's an anecdote that I think of all the time. So earlier in my career, I was working with a man who I felt didn't take me seriously. You know, he occasionally referred to my work as pink work, for example. And you know, and I knew that, you know, there was a problem with him seeing as me as legitimate. And I took this to my coach. And I said, I've really got to work on this person. How can I make him take me more seriously? And she looked at me and she said, you're not going to give a single second more thought to solving his problem for him. The fact he doesn't take you seriously has nothing to do with you. You're going to go about continuing to have your voice, be authentic, you know, have your own personal style. You don't have to adapt your personal style and the way that you speak in order to be acceptable and legitimate to him. And I've always thought about that in terms of, you know, it is not my responsibility to answer to and mirror a world that is prejudiced against me. I don't have to carry that load. And, you know, I've got 2 daughters as well. And I often think about all the work that's done, you know, girls empowerment and girls are strong. And it's like they have to take responsibility for all this change. And I wonder how much work is being done with the boys to say, how are you going to change?
But I think it's women like us raising sons. I mean, I don't have a son, but my sister has. My sister's got 3 sons, and I think it's women like us raising boys who are going to be wired differently than our parents' generation. Hopefully.
Yeah, you already see that though. Right?
Yes.
My kids are in primary school and you definitely already see that. So, which is so positive and it's so great to see. And, you know, you even see it in children's films and in TV programs and the stuff they're growing up with and the books they're reading. Yeah.
Sabine, I'm really interested to hear about the government level. So Baudin talked about the connection piece and how important that is to support women. And Code V, one of the focuses now as you're going through that implementation stage is creating that community of support through websites and panel organisations to really empower female entrepreneurs to be connected with other people in that situation. How important is that network and mentoringship in terms of helping women discover and articulate their thoughts and their opinions effectively?
Well, firstly, I think it's extremely important. I think the thing that Becky just mentioned about, you know, how the focus is on the women and, you know, having to fix sort of the women. One of the things that we say around the code and also other organizations related to the code is, you know, we have to fix the system, not the women, right? So there's a lot of, that's literally one of the sort of the slogans that we stole a little bit from, and super important organization in the Netherlands called Women Inc. Go look it up, and they're advocating this as well, fixing the system, not the women. And there's, so the code is also works together with, and I'm in a council board with one of them, with academic researchers that, through academic research try to fix the system. So that's a very important thing. So yeah, and I think the strategies that we and within the code try to implement is basically what Becky and Baudine also earlier said, creating a safe space for women, where they can find each other through mentor programs. We offer mentorship programs where experienced female entrepreneurs provide guidance and advice and support, and trying to help them navigate the challenges they face in their industries. Networking events, right? People have to find each other, find your allies, find your role models, and connect with other like-minded people and potential investors, obviously, right? Because one of the goals of the code is also trying to improve the access to finance for female entrepreneurs. One of the things we discovered through speaking with women was that they experience in pitching their ideas to investors, like, oh, that's a bunch of mothers sitting around the kitchen table, like having, it's, and then with men, it's like, oh, that's such a cool idea, so that whole bias. And with men pitching their ideas, people are looking at their ambitions and their ideas. With women, as research has found, people are looking at their history, their proven track record, right? It's completely the other way around. So by training and workshops, it's also trying to get rid of that bias, also with men, right? Because getting the unconsciousness into the conscious space, you can actually, find what needs to change also with yourself, right? I mean, as a woman not of color, I also experience certain biases that once I become aware of them, like Becky just mentioned around, women of color, it's just, that helps. So through training and workshops, we try as a strategy to get rid of that bias, as I said, the access to funding, visibility and representation, right? If you feel represented within your industry, that helps. So we do try through media campaigns, speaking opportunities and partnerships with industry associations. We try to help showcasing women's achievements and their contributions. And then, as I also mentioned, educational initiatives, right? So to raise that awareness about biases and the challenges faced, that can help foster a more inclusive and supportive environment. So with the code, we're only just beginning and the sky is the freaking limit. So, and we are super ambitious about everything. So these are a few of those strategies that we try to implement. So
it's so exciting. It's so exciting what you have launched and the fact that it's now live, obviously it was launched in December of last year. Do you think it's going to take off in terms of other jurisdictions and countries?
Yeah, we already noticed, interest from, so obviously, I think an important thing of the code is that I think one of the successes, well, we have to see that, but I think is that the partnership with the government, right? Because it's, the public support and the government support, it's just helps creating that, the seriousness and the reach and so, and the sort of stamp of approval of the initiative. So the government has already been approached by other countries that were interested in learning about, this initiative. I think Hungary was one of them. The World Bank has a similar initiative that's focused on countries
Developing countries.
Yeah, developing countries to do the same. So we also try to team up with the World Bank. It's called the WE-FI code, the WE-FI initiative, and so it's super important because that creates like global support. This is not a local issue. This is a global issue. So hence I'm also super happy, to have this global moment, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a global issue. It's an individual issue. It's a corporate issue. It's a government issue. I mean, everybody has a responsibility, don't they, to enact change? And I love your point, Sabine, about fixing the system, not the women. I mean, that's so key. In the meantime, we need to inspire and harness women with the tools to fight that, because it is an exhausting fight. We've all been fighting it. We will continue to fight it. Our children will probably continue to fight it. But Bardine, just kind of on that point, and I know you touched on a lot of these points earlier, but what advice would you give to anybody who's lacking confidence expressing themselves for fear of being ignored or not taken seriously? Any tips that you
So
share?
yeah, I've got some practical tips, but before that, like what you shared, Becky, about your coach telling you it was his problem and you just had to focus on being you. It's so important to remain authentic, to remain true to yourself, or otherwise, I mean, you're just gonna be miserable if you don't. But that's a really key point, right? You know, make sure that you remain you. You were hired to do a job. That's the job you're doing, but it was you that was hired, right? And so in that kind of context, if you're being dismissed at work or not being heard, one thing that I have found extremely useful in my career is relying on the written word. So I have a meeting, I say something, it's not listened to, I say something else, it's not listened to. After the meeting, I write an email to the whole group and I say, as I shared with you on our call just now, or I made this point in the meeting, but as there was a lot discussed, I thought it'd be helpful to share my points again by email. Like these are strategies, right? And they really do work because they keep seeing your name pop up in email and they realize, oh yeah, she did say that. They have time to read it slowly. They have time to reflect. And it's there. There's a written record, right?
And then it can't be misappropriated by somebody else claiming it.
No, and you have to persevere as well, right? Like this is not just a one-hit wonder thing. You keep going. You have to practice. You have to keep at it. You have to keep speaking up, keep using your voice, as long as you remain polite.
Yes, with a smile.
Yeah.
We're almost out of time, believe it or not. So I've just got one final question for all of you. What is your top tip for women to find their voice? Becky, we're going to start with you.
So I'm going to base mine around two quotes. So my first, I think it's a Brené Brown quote. I can never be on a webinar without mentioning her. But anyway, the quote is about courage is contagious. And I think my top tip is the more we do it, the more all of us do it, the more permission, the more safety, the more collective power we give to each other. So that's my first thing is to do it, and the ripples, and you know, those of us who are now perhaps a little bit further on in our careers, you know, we have that power, let's use it. And my second is I have a quote up on my wall that actually my daughters gave me, so I love it particularly, from Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And it says, speak your mind, even if your voice shakes. I love that quote.
Love that.
And it's just that moment of like finding your courage.
Yes.
And in that moment, if you're standing there on both feet thinking, can I do this? Speak your mind, even if your voice shakes.
Yeah.
Wow.
Use that encouragement to push you.
Yeah. And what an example of that she was.
Yeah, she really was. Incredible. Sabine, what about you? What's your top tip?
I would say continue to practice your self-affirmation and self-compassion. I think, you know, that really, really can help in, you know, in reminding yourself of your worth, your strengths, and your unique perspectives, right? Engage maybe in activities that can boost your confidence, such as this public speaking moment, right? You know, speaking, you know, it can really, really help. Writing, I think, as Baudine also mentioned, join supportive communities where you can express yourself freely and basically practice, you know, expressing your voice. And I think the most important thing is just remember that your voice matters and your perspective is valuable. Really, it is, you know, and I think that that memory is I think key, because yeah, we all need that.
Yeah, it's good to retain that as a starting point. Thank you. Bardine, top tip?
Well, I mean, Becky and Sabine have said it so well. So I will keep it very short. Just don't give up.
Yeah.
Whatever you do, don't give up.
Yeah.
That is my top tip.
That is a wonderful point to lead on. Thank you. We're just going to move to questions from our audience. We've got 5 minutes left. So I've got a question for each of you, actually. So we've actually had a few questions around this. Becky, for you first. What is your view in relation to women in the workplace not supporting and speaking up for their female colleagues? And do you have any advice for women who might be experiencing this? So I guess that comes down to kind of allyship, but from female colleagues as opposed to men? Great question.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I, I guess one thing to remember is maybe women who aren't being allies, who aren't speaking up, they are subject to many of the patriarchal, cultural forces that everybody else is. And, I can't speak for the stories of those women. They may be in fear, they may have internalized all those things. So I'm always careful to remember that actually, all of us are subject to those things. But I would also really encourage courageous conversations with those women and to say, this is my experience. This is my experience of, that sort of, when we talk about psychological safety, I think sometimes we think about it as everybody has to feel comfortable all the time. And actually, really, it's about getting more comfortable with discomfort and kind of honest conversations and hard conversations. So I think my encouragement would be perhaps with other people to try and have an open dialogue and be curious and understand about what is happening in that relationship and see what you can unlock.
So call out the behavior.
To call out the behavior, or maybe to call, to maybe stand alongside that woman. We can't make assumptions that there may be all kinds of things behind that, but get curious about what is going on for her.
Yes.
Explain your perspective, stand in each other's shoes.
Yes.
So much of this is about sharing lived experience.
Yeah.
Trying, this should be a movement of women standing together.
Yeah.
The more I think we can stand in each other's shoes, empathize, speak truth, give candid feedback, the better. So I think for me, it would be rooted in those kind of honest, courageous, curious conversations to really understand from both sides what's happening.
And they might be exhausted from the fight, mightn't they?
Yeah. And don't underestimate the power of vulnerability, right? Just by showing vulnerability, we can help each other as well.
Yeah, so true.
And that is a gift, somebody holding up the mirror to you and saying, you are, as I say, I often am aware, I have so many privileges as a white woman, as now a senior woman and a CEO. I have all kinds of agency that other women do not have and that I didn't have in my career. And I've got used to that now. I will have my own biases. So somebody holding a mirror up to me, that's a gift.
Yeah.
And so I think actually to see it as a dialogue and an exchange is a helpful way of looking at it.
Sabine, I've got a great question for you. What advice do you have to find your voice when you know you're going to be communicating with very male dominant characters, particularly for entrepreneurs when, you're trying to obviously impress them to get funding?
Yeah, good question. I would say, well, I think Baudine also mentioned it. Don't lose your authenticity because it will show, right? So I would stand 100% behind the product that you're pitching and be proud of what you're pitching. And I wouldn't change a thing. I would just make sure that you have your story straight, be authentic, and show them the potential of your product and how it can help and create value for their business, right? So I think that's the biggest tip. And practice, right? So there's in the Netherlands, there's so many organizations that help women practice their pitch and give feedback, so practice your pitch with male friends, male colleagues, and see what the feedback is, and but I think the most important thing is, you're standing there for a reason. So make them aware of that and be authentic. That's the most important thing, I think.
And have that self-belief.
You can also be honest too, right? If you're standing there and you sense that they're not listening, you just say, I know I'm a woman. I know that this is a room full of men, but and suddenly that also kind of people start paying attention.
Yeah. Or as you said, call out those biases that you're maybe afraid of, right? And counter them. Yeah.
And final question, because we are almost out of time. Baudine, for you, do you think there's a difference between creating a safe space versus getting comfortable and financially stable enough to be able to articulate one's position in the workplace without fear of repercussions?
That's a very dynamic question.
It is.
There's a lot to that, right? I wouldn't encourage people to put themselves at risk financially, or, you know, that, like, it's so personal, that question. I think, you know, Becky talked a lot about the obligation on organization, right? That's really important to remember. And on allies and on us as a collective to create safe spaces. So that second part, the, you know, putting yourself at risk financially never even comes up, right? That we have better systems in place, that we have better processes in place, that there's more equality and a better balance of power when you're dealing with all of these situations. I mean, I know I'm kind of going off on a tangent, but because that question is, I mean, it's a great question, but yeah, we have to just work together.
Yeah.
It's very, very tough, but yeah.
We're actually not just out of time, we are over time. So I'm going to have to draw this to a close. But thank you so much to all three of you, brilliant panelists, for sharing your insights, your honesty, your candor, your humour. So Baldine, Sabine, Becky, I'm so grateful that you all took part in this and that you all prepared so much. And we will be sharing some of the reference quotes that all three panelists mentioned during the course of this. So we'll follow up in an email. But thank you to all of you for being part of this empowering conversation today. You know, our journey to find our voices and champion gender equality is ongoing, but with the determination and, you know, the shared commitment, we are actually making meaningful strides forward. It might not feel like it, particularly with some of the issues that we've all referenced today, but we are actually getting there. And I think as we reflect on the insights shared and the stories exchanged today by Baldine, Becky and Sabine, we really should carry forward that spirit of empowerment and resilience. You know, we need to continue to together challenge the status quo, break down the barriers, lift one another up as we navigate through these male-dominated industries and organisations, and be inspired by the stories that you've heard from all three of your panellists. And also just remember that finding your voice is not about speaking up, it's owning your worth. You know, that point that Becky mentioned about not worrying about what they think of you. It's what you think of yourself, and embracing your unique perspective, being authentic and paving the way for a more inclusive and equitable environment. So let's all amplify our voices together. Let's collectively shape a world where every woman is heard, valued and empowered to thrive, and let's together make a difference. Thank you all. Until next time, stay empowered and keep finding your voice.
Thank you.
Thanks.